The dining hall fell silent the moment Margaret Ashworth slammed her glass on the table. Everyone turned to look at Alina Whitfield, who stood frozen near the kitchen door with a tray of empty plates still in her hands. Something had gone wrong, and every eye in the room now pointed at her. Alina had worked in the Ashworth mansion for almost a year. She arrived early, left late, and never once complained. The family barely noticed her presence. To them, she was simply a pair of hands that cleaned floors and carried dishes. Nobody asked about her past. Nobody cared where she came from. That evening, the Ashworths were hosting an important dinner. Businessmen, diplomats, and foreign partners sat around the long table, discussing deals worth millions. Charles Ashworth wanted to impress his guests, especially a quiet man named Lawrence Bennett, who had connections across 3 continents. Alina moved between the table and the kitchen, refilling glasses and clearing plates, careful not to draw attention. She had learned long ago that being invisible was safer than being seen. But invisibility has its limits. While serving dessert, Alina overheard 2 guests speaking quietly in French, believing no one around them could understand. One of them made a joke about the Ashworth family, calling them impressive on the surface but empty underneath. Alina's lips twitched, almost breaking into a smile before she caught herself. She quickly composed her face and continued pouring coffee. But Lawrence Bennett noticed. He watched her carefully, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. He said something else in French, testing her, watching for a reaction. Alina's hand paused for half a second, a flicker of recognition crossing her eyes. That tiny pause changed everything. "Wait," Bennett said, switching to English, his voice sharp with interest. "Did you understand what I just said?" The table went quiet. Margaret Ashworth's fork froze midair. Charles's face turned red with embarrassment. Alina kept her eyes down. "I apologize, sir. I did not mean to listen." "That is not what I asked," Bennett replied, leaning forward. "I asked if you understood." The room waited. Alina felt every gaze pressing against her like weight on her shoulders. She had spent a year hiding, keeping her head low, staying silent about who she used to be. Now, with one careless glance, all of that control was slipping away. Margaret spoke before Alina could answer. "She's just the maid," she said, her tone dismissive, almost cruel. "She probably picked up a few words cleaning hotel rooms somewhere." A few guests chuckled. Charlotte, the daughter, rolled her eyes and whispered something to her brother Oliver, who smirked. Alina said nothing. She simply picked up the empty tray and turned toward the kitchen, her heart pounding, her mind racing back to a life she thought she had buried forever. But Lawrence Bennett was not finished. He rose from his chair, his gaze following her retreating figure. "Wait," he said again, his voice carrying across the room with quiet authority. "I don't think she's just the maid." The room fell into a tense, uncertain silence, and Alina stopped walking, her hand trembling slightly on the tray she carried. Charles Ashworth stood up quickly, forcing a laugh to break the tension. "Lawrence, please, don't waste your time with the help. Sit, let's continue with the wine tasting." But Lawrence Bennett did not sit. He walked slowly around the table until he stood a few feet from Alina. His eyes studied her face with an intensity that made the other guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Alina, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady, though her fingers still gripped the tray tightly. "Alina," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Then, without warning, he spoke again in French, asking her directly what she thought of the evening's conversation about global trade routes. The room held its breath. Margaret let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, please, she won't understand a word of that." But Alina did understand. Every word. And something inside her, something she had suppressed for years, refused to stay silent any longer. She set the tray down gently on the sideboard and turned to face Lawrence Bennett directly. Her posture changed. Her shoulders straightened. The nervous maid who had been clearing plates moments earlier seemed to disappear, replaced by someone entirely different. "The trade routes you mentioned," she said in flawless French, her accent smooth and precise, "have shifted significantly since the new tariffs were introduced last spring. Many companies are now rerouting through smaller ports to avoid the added costs." Silence swallowed the room whole. Charlotte's mouth fell open. Oliver put down his glass, his smirk gone completely. Margaret's face turned pale, then red with something that looked like humiliation mixed with disbelief. Lawrence Bennett's eyes lit up with delight. "Remarkable," he whispered. Then, testing her further, he switched to German, asking about recent economic policies in Europe. Without hesitation, Alina answered again, this time in perfect German, discussing interest rates and manufacturing exports as though she had studied the subject her entire life. The other guests began whispering among themselves, some in astonishment, others in confusion. One woman at the table, a banker from Zurich, leaned forward and asked a question in Italian, half expecting Alina to fail this time. She did not fail. Alina answered fluently, switching languages as easily as breathing, moving from Italian to Spanish, then briefly touching on a phrase in Portuguese to clarify a point about currency exchange. Charles Ashworth stood frozen at the head of the table, his earlier confidence completely drained from his face. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. The woman who had mocked Alina moments earlier now looked as though she wanted to disappear into the floor. Lawrence Bennett turned toward Charles with a stern expression. "You have quite an extraordinary member of staff here, Mr. Ashworth. I wonder if you truly understand who has been serving your table all this time." The guests exchanged glances, murmurs rippling across the room like a wave no one could stop. Charles Ashworth's jaw tightened. He could not let this moment slip away without regaining control in front of his most important guest. His pride, wounded and desperate, pushed him toward a decision he would soon regret. "Fine," he said, forcing his voice to sound calm. "If she truly knows so much, let her prove it properly. Let's see if this is a party trick or something real." He turned to Alina, his eyes cold. "9 languages, that is what my guest seems to believe you know. Prove it, right here, right now." The room tensed further. Margaret shot her husband a warning glance, sensing the danger in pushing this further, but Charles was too consumed by his bruised ego to stop. Alina stood quietly for a moment, studying the faces around her. She had spent so long hiding her past, swallowing her pride, accepting insults without response. But something about this moment felt different. She was tired of shrinking herself to fit into the small space they had given her. "Very well," she said softly. Lawrence Bennett gestured for her to take a seat at the table, an invitation that visibly startled everyone present. Margaret opened her mouth to object, but a sharp look from Bennett silenced her. Alina remained standing instead, choosing to face the room on her own terms. One by one, the guests began testing her. A diplomat from Russia asked a question about historical treaties, and Alina answered in fluent Russian, her pronunciation crisp and confident. A businessman from Japan asked about trade negotiations, and she replied in Japanese, bowing slightly out of respect as she spoke. Next came Mandarin, then Arabic. Each question met with calm, precise answers that left the guests stunned into silence. She discussed politics, economics, literature, and history, moving effortlessly between subjects and languages as though she had trained for this moment her entire life. By the time she finished responding to a question in Korean, even the most skeptical guests had stopped doubting her. The room was no longer filled with judgment, but admiration. Charles Ashworth stood at the head of the table, his face a mixture of shock and something close to shame. He had wanted to expose her as a fraud, to prove his family's superiority in front of his guests. Instead, He had revealed his own ignorance and cruelty to everyone present. Margaret said nothing. Her earlier mockery now felt like a wound reopened, except this time everyone could see exactly how wrong she had been. Charlotte and Oliver sat in stunned silence, their earlier smirks replaced with wide, uncertain eyes. They had grown up believing certain people simply did not matter, that status defined worth. Watching Alina speak with such grace and intelligence shattered that belief in front of them. Lawrence Bennett finally broke the silence, rising from his chair with a slow, respectful applause. Other guests joined him, one by one, until the entire room filled with quiet, genuine appreciation. "Remarkable," Bennett said again, shaking his head slowly. "Absolutely remarkable. Alina, might I ask, where did someone with such extraordinary skill learn to speak 9 languages so beautifully?" Alina took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. "I was once a translator," she said quietly. "I worked for an international organization, helping negotiate agreements between countries. I traveled constantly, meeting leaders, attorneys, and business owners from around the world." The room listened closely, hanging on every word. "3 years ago, my husband became very ill," she continued. "The medical costs were more than we could manage. I left my position to care for him, spending every saving we had. When he passed, there was nothing left. No savings, no home, no career to return to. I needed work quickly, and this was the only position available at the time." Margaret's face flushed with a fresh wave of shame. She had spent months treating Alina as though she were beneath notice, never once asking about her life or her struggles. Lawrence Bennett listened with deep respect, nodding slowly. "I remember your name now," he said suddenly. "Alina Whitfield. You worked on the trade agreement between 3 nations several years ago. I read reports about your work. Brilliant negotiations, if I recall correctly." Alina nodded, a small, surprised smile crossing her face. She had not expected anyone to remember her contributions from that chapter of her life. "You disappeared from that world rather suddenly," Bennett continued. "Many people wondered what happened to you." "Life happened," Alina replied simply. "Sometimes we lose everything we built, and we must find new ways to survive." The guests around the table exchanged glances, clearly moved by her honesty and quiet strength. Even Charles Ashworth, standing rigid and silent, seemed to finally understand the gravity of what his household had overlooked for an entire year. Bennett stood taller, his expression shifting from admiration to something more purposeful. "Alina, I currently need someone with exactly your skills for an important project. My company is expanding operations into several new countries, and we require someone who can navigate both language and culture with precision. Someone with your experience and talent would be invaluable." The room fell silent again, but this silence carried hope rather than tension. "I am offering you a position," Bennett said clearly, "as our lead international liaison. The salary would reflect your true value, not the value others have placed on you until tonight." Alina's hands trembled slightly, this time from something entirely different than fear. Emotion swelled in her chest as she processed the offer. Charlotte, watching quietly from her seat, finally spoke. "I am sorry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We never asked about you. We should have." Oliver nodded beside his sister, clearly humbled by the events of the evening. Margaret remained silent, unable to meet Alina's eyes, while Charles simply stared at the floor, the weight of his earlier arrogance pressing heavily upon him. Alina looked around the room, at the guests who had doubted her, and at the family who had ignored her for so long. Then she turned back to Lawrence Bennett, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. "I accept," she said simply. The room erupted into quiet applause once more, filled with genuine warmth this time. Even the guests who had chuckled at her expense earlier now looked at her with newfound respect. Later that evening, After the guests had left and the mansion grew quiet, Alina walked upstairs to gather her belongings from the small room she had occupied for the past year. It was a modest space, tucked away near the back staircase, far from the grand rooms where the family lived their comfortable lives. As she packed her few possessions into a single bag, Margaret appeared quietly at the door. Her earlier arrogance had faded, replaced by something closer to humility. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said softly, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I judged you unfairly. I never once considered that you had a life before this house, a story of your own." Alina paused, folding a sweater carefully. "Everyone has a story," she replied gently. "Sometimes people simply choose not to look for it." Margaret nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I hope you find happiness in your new position, truly." "Thank you," Alina said, offering a small, genuine smile. There was no anger in her voice, no desire for revenge. She had spent enough years carrying bitterness. She did not wish to carry it any further into her new beginning. Downstairs, Charles waited near the front door, looking noticeably smaller than he had at the dinner table. "I was wrong to challenge you the way I did," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I let my pride control my actions. I am sorry." Alina simply nodded, accepting his apology without needing to say more. Words had already done their work tonight. Charlotte and Oliver stood nearby, both looking at Alina with expressions far different from the ones they wore just hours earlier. "Will we see you again?" Charlotte asked, her voice hopeful. "Perhaps," Alina replied warmly. "Life has a way of bringing people back together when least expected." With her bag over her shoulder, Alina walked toward the front door, where a car sent by Lawrence Bennett waited to take her to begin the next chapter of her life. She paused at the threshold, turning back one last time to look at the mansion that had, for 1 year, made her feel invisible. She did not feel small anymore. Stepping outside into the cool evening air, Alina breathed deeply, feeling lighter than she had in years. The stars above seemed brighter somehow, as though the universe itself was celebrating her quiet, well-earned victory. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Alina looked ahead toward the road stretching before her, filled with new possibilities. She thought of her late husband, of the years of struggle behind her, and of the strength she had carried through it all without ever losing herself. She had been underestimated, mocked, and dismissed, yet through it all she remained true to who she really was. And now, finally, the world was ready to see her clearly.